Meant to Represent is a program created by the League of Women Voters of Nebraska and people-powered Fair Maps. Hello and welcome, Nebraskans. I'm Carol Dennison, and I'm here with Rachel Gibson, today's presenter. We are proud members of the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. When most people think of the League, they think of the 1920s and the suffragists who marched to win women the vote. But actually, for the last 100 years, we have expanded voter access and worked to protect voters' rights. We strive for nonpartisan and open policies to protect voters and democracy. These days, we're concerned about the process of redistricting. We're here to alert you to a way your vote can be weakened by politicians in power, and you may have no idea that it is happening. Once every 10 years, the census gives us the number of people in our country. That gives us the basis to draw districts for choosing our representatives. For years, this has been done behind closed doors and has been manipulated. So we have joined with the National League as members of people-powered Fair Maps to make sure redistricting is fair in all 50 states and definitely in Nebraska. As Americans, we believe in equality, fairness, and justice. We're working to preserve those values in our government. We want the redistricting process to respect all voters regardless of their ethnicity, race, political party, or economic status by drawing lines that fairly represent our communities. Bottom line, we want voters to choose their representatives, not politicians in power to choose their voters. Today, we want you to come away with a good idea of what voting districts are, why they're important, why does it matter to you right here in Nebraska. We'll give you ways that you can make your voice heard in the process, especially in 2021, the year that the maps will be redrawn. Take a look at this map of Nebraska. Each of these sections on the map represents a voting district for a state senator. Just a couple of quick questions for you. You happen to know the number of the district you live in? And maybe do you know the name of your state senator? Hang on to those questions for a little bit later. Take a look at the map again. If you notice, these state districts are very geometrically shaped. However, if we look down at modern gerrymandered states, some of the districts don't look so symmetrical. We can see in Florida, Illinois, North Carolina, and Ohio, things are a little bit different. When these maps were drawn, they were drawn to either exclude or include certain voters. They actually were drawn to ensure the victory of the party in power. Sometimes, but not always, you can tell a gerrymandered district just by looking at it. Let's take a minute to have John Oliver's take on gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering is a real problem. It's the practice of drawing voting districts in a way that creates unfair advantages for whoever happens to be drawing the lines, which does sound mundane, but the results can be significant. Gerrymandering is partly responsible for giving Republicans such an edge in the House of Representatives, because take a look at what happened in some states where they drew the district lines.
In Pennsylvania, 44% of the voters chose Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives in 2014. But 13 of the 18 districts, more than 2/3, are represented by Republicans. In Ohio, about 40% of the voters chose Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives, but 12 out of 16 seats, 3/4 of them, are represented by Republicans.
Those numbers are way out of proportion to what people should expect. You wouldn't accept Neapolitan ice cream that was 75% strawberry. How is that okay? What perverts voted for this?
Thanks, John, for a lasting memory between redistricting and Neapolitan ice cream. So if this gerrymandering is so unfair, Why hasn't anyone put a stop to it? You might think that the Supreme Court would have something to say. In fact, in 2019, they did. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that partisan gerrymandering was a political question and that they had no authority to reallocate power between the two parties. You can see that the state courts objected to partisan gerrymandering in North Carolina, Michigan, and more. Nebraskans agree that redistricting should also be kept nonpartisan, according to an ACLU survey conducted in 2020. So the Supreme Court has left the question to the states, the people, and Congress to resolve. So who's left to keep it fair? I guess just you, me, and all the people. Time to hand the mic over to Rachel. She'll give you the inside story on how the process can go wrong, some areas of concern in Nebraska, our timeline, and how you can get involved along the way. Rachel, take it from here.
Hi, I'm Rachel Gibson, and as Carol said, I am excited to talk a little bit about the nuances and the details of redistricting. So we're going to jump right in. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to take a minute and think about your own community. Think about what makes your community your home, your neighborhood. Specifically, I'd love you to take a few seconds and write down 3 to 5 physical markers that are important in your community. So that could be a church, it could be a school, it could be a river or a friend's barn, whatever are those physical things that come to mind when you think of your community. So write down 3 to 5 of those. Second, I want you to think about how you describe your community. So if you had someone who was moving in and you said, oh yeah, that's my neighborhood, what's the fill in the blank? How would you describe your community in 3 to 5 words? And the reason I'd like to start here is because we're going to get into the rules of redistricting. We're going to get into all the legislation and the details and that sort of thing. But ultimately, this is what it comes back to. It's about representing your community for what your community is. So we're going to tuck this away for now, but have that going on in the back of your mind as we talk through the rest of the presentation. So let's start from the very beginning and talk about what is a voting district. So you hear a lot about redistricting districts. What is that? Conceptually, pretty easy. It's the place where you live, work, and learn. It's your community, it's your neighborhood. In Nebraska, we have a wide variety of those types of communities, and each of them are different. More practically, we're talking about a geographic area where you choose who represents you at multiple levels of government. Okay, so we're starting to build some lines around this nebulous thing that is your community. Now, I mentioned multiple levels of government. So if you think about it, you have maybe your city, and your city voting district within that might be your city councilor. You go one bigger, maybe you're talking about your county level. So this might include a police department or a fire department. That might include, a school district. So that's getting a little larger. Then you have your state. So these are the folks that we send to Lincoln to make the laws for Nebraska. And then you're also part of a voting district for your country. So that's who do we send to Washington to advocate for Nebraskans. So every person is part of multiple voting districts. Why are we even talking about voting districts? Why are these important? Well, pretty simply, because each district is very different. There are different characteristics and different needs for different communities. And you elect someone from your community to go advocate for what you need in your community. There's also some state and federal resources and dollars that get allocated based on your community. So just as a Nebraska example, think about if a lot of folks in your district are employed by natural resources or farmers, that type of thing. Those might be folks who are really worried about property taxes or water policy. Now think about someone who lives in an area where there are a significant number of renters. So more people rent than own their homes. They're probably going to want someone who's advocating for policies that protect renters and have rules for landlords, things like that. Even things like military service. And you can see these are maps from our legislative research office that show in Nebraska, there's differences in our communities. So the folks who are advocating for us are going to be focused on different things. Why are districts important for the second reason? We're talking about high stakes stuff with broad impact. A great way to think about this is just in terms of money. So when you think about here, this snapshot, this pie chart here is the revenue. So the money that comes into the state that then we get to use. You can see that 30% of that, or 4.1 billion from last year, came from the federal government. And so those are federal dollars coming into our state that our senators are advocating for where those are going to go, how it's going to get spent, in whose community, those types of things. Now, we're talking districts. Districts hang out for 10 years. That's how long you have a district before you kind of reassess it. When we talk about the amount of money in the next 10 years, that's 27 billion federal dollars coming into the state over the next 10 years. So you want your district to be a representation of you so that you can have someone advocating for your needs. And then also this relates to who you're voting for. So when we think about the next 10 years, that's 2 presidential elections, 15 US House of Representatives seats, and 122 state Senate seats. Those are some big numbers. So when we talk about redistricting, this is why it's important. And reason number 3 why this is important is because minute boundary changes can make a huge difference. We're really going to get down into the details. And why? Because, especially in Nebraska, there have been some really close races. People who have won by a couple hundred votes, sometimes even a couple dozen votes. Why does that matter? Well, first of all, that could be a block. Where you draw a line for a district could change hugely who is able to run and be elected. And then why does that matter? Because some votes are really close in our legislature. So when you think about it, there's actually a recent bill that was moving through our legislature to approve medical marijuana. And it did not move forward because of 2 votes. 2 votes of our 49 senators. So that's why this matters, is because the details, the nuance, the tiny pieces actually do make a huge difference. So let's talk a little bit about Nebraska districts. I mentioned that we're all members of different districts. These are 4 of them. So we've got our Board of Education, our Board of Regents, which works with our colleges and universities, our judicial system, so the different courts, and then our Public Service Commission. We're unique in Nebraska in that we have publicly owned public services. So these are 4 of the districts. Now, what's really interesting is if you've gone to vote or when you do vote in the future, you might go in, and I always run into that as I'm looking at my ballot and I'm like, oh, judges, yeah, I got to vote for this. So there are all these different districts that we're voting for. Today, we're talking about mostly 2 levels, our state legislative districts and our House of Representative legislative districts, our congressional ones. So we're going to start with the state. So these are the folks that we elect in our communities to send to Lincoln to make decisions on our behalf, to make laws, tax policy, those types of things. Here's a map. You can see that we have 49 different areas, and they're based on population. So that's why they're kind of different sizes and shapes. I want to hone in on a couple things here because I think this starts to highlight some really important points. First, these are the Lincoln and the Omaha Metro, respectively. And you'll see when you look at the numbering that we've got 49 and 46 right here in the middle of a bunch of teens and 20s and next to District 2. And this represents this idea that we're constantly adjusting our districts. Our districts aren't set and done. Every time that we look at how many people we have in our state and where they live, we adjust our districts accordingly. So 49 was most recently moved to it's lifted and shifted to the Omaha Metro. 49 used to be in Western Nebraska. So this ever evolving, changing districts is something that happens regularly. The other piece I want to highlight here is Hall County. So this is Grand Island. And what's interesting is that District 35 is completely inside District 34. This really highlights the idea that we're talking about population because that is Grand Island. It also highlights this red line here is where the district cuts across the city. So best practice is to keep county lines intact, keep cities intact, but sometimes you can't based on population. So then you pick where you draw the line. And that's when it gets really interesting. So for example, in the last redistricting, one of our state senators actually said that he moved a line over so that his favorite coffee shop could be in his district. That's the level we're talking about here. So that was our state. Now we're looking at our national level. In Nebraska, we have 3 House seats. So quick refresher, the way our government works on the federal level, Congress, the legislative branch that makes the laws, has 2 houses. The Senate, every state has 2 senators, and the House of Representatives, which is based on population. So for us in Nebraska, we have 3 representatives based on our population. Places like California have in the 50s. So based on our population, and then we're split in these 3 different areas. So you'll see the biggest chunk is the Nebraska 3rd. The 1st is kind of that middle section, and then the Nebraska 2nd, which you've probably heard a lot about, is that kind of Omaha metro area. A quick note about precincts. So as we shift gears here, precincts are not the same thing as districts. Precincts are the logistical tool to make elections happen, if you will. So these, when you talk about going to your precinct, this is the church or the school or wherever where you go and you actually vote on voting day. Again, you're part of multiple districts. So when you go, you're going to be voting for a lot of different things, and that ballot's unique to you. But the precinct is the piece that kind of helps the voting happen, if you will. So I think this is a really helpful map here. When you look at this, you'll see over here the light shaded, those are the different legislative districts. And then the blue lines break it up into precincts. So this is a great example, Sarpy County here. You can see here that in Sarpy County, there are 5 different legislative districts. And then within those districts, they're split at different levels for precinct because it's based on population. So you'll see here in District 2, there's only 3 for a huge amount of space because population-wise, there only needs to be that many precincts. Whereas in District 14, lots of people, far more in a smaller area for your precinct. So precincts, not the same as districts, but an important piece. And in the big picture, really important when it comes to voter access, and in not so good ways, voter suppression. All right, so back to districts. How are districts determined? So we've got these districts, how are they determined? The general way it happens is 3 steps. Number 1, count all the people. Number 2, divide the people equally. Number 3, draw lines around those people. It's that straightforward. So let's dive into that a bit. Number 1, count the people. We use our official census. That's the official population of the US. This is a federally run and coordinated, so national level coordinated. It happens every 10 years. And the goal is to count every person or resident, regardless of citizenship status, because these numbers get used for lots of different things, including services. So you need to really know who's needing services in a place to be able to support them. It's also used to allocate federal funds in addition to building these districts. Okay, so you've counted everybody. The next step is called apportionment. And this is basically math. You take how many people you have and you divide it by how many seats there are in the House of Representatives. So there are 435 seats in the US House of Representatives, total number, divide it by that 435, and you get the ideal number of people in a district. Basically, this provides a guideline to states to then draw their maps. And that brings us to redistricting, which is the actual drawing, adjusting of those districts to align with population changes. Now, this is state run. So we're getting the data from the federal level, but then each state is responsible for coordinating and dividing up their districts. Their aim is to create roughly equal districts. Therefore, someone who's a House representative is representing essentially the same amount of people. That's the general idea. So how are districts apportioned? With pizza math. My husband claims this is the most important type of math, but it's actually a really good visual. So let's imagine you've got a pizza. You have 20 pepperonis on that pizza. You want 4 slices with even number of pepperonis on each. So that's 5 pepperonis per slice. Easy. chop it in half again. You've got 4 slices, 5 pepperonis each. Unfortunately, your pizza probably does not look like this, nor does our country as far as population. Probably looks a little more like this. If we use that same logic, same space, physical space, suddenly you have a piece with 1 pepperoni and a piece with 10 pepperonis, which is not what we're aiming for. So you got to get creative about how you draw your slices. With a little tweaking here and there, you get, again, 4 slices of pizza, 5 pepperonis each. So we just talked about this idea of apportionment in terms of pizza. So how do we cut different districts, different slices of the pizza so that they're equal number of pepperonis on each piece? So how do we cut that pizza? Who decides how we cut that pizza? So a little bit about how districts are determined. They happen in one of 4 ways. And keep in mind that this happens at the state level. So this is either done by state legislatures, bipartisan commissions, a citizens commission, or a panel of civil servants. So folks who work for the government in a state. In Nebraska, our state legislature draws our districts. Regardless of what way this happens, what method of redistricting, every process should include some key things. And those are primarily around open, transparent communication with the public. And all of these are subject to open meeting laws that already exist regarding our government. So where do these rules come from? Well, they come from a couple different places. The first place is the US Constitution. And basically what the US Constitution says is you have to count everybody every 10 years, and then you need to have them be representative. And kind of leaves it at that. So since then, there have been a lot of different pieces of legislation, including the Permanent Apportionment Act, which outlined procedure and timeline that had to be done in a reasonable timeline, and several other cases, Supreme Court cases that have kind of set the rules about what apportionment and districting needs to look like. One of those is Reynolds versus Sims, which really honed in on this idea of 1 person, 1 vote, and let's make sure we're drawing our maps. So that's what we get. And then finally, the Voting Rights Act, which was a huge piece that talked about the ability to draw districts that don't discriminate based on different things like race and ethnicity, things like that. However, like Joanna talked about, the Supreme Court recently has said, it's not illegal to gerrymander based on politics. And really that's out of our jurisdiction. So if you don't want to do it, then you need to pass some legislation related to that. And there currently is that legislation up right now. There's 2 pieces of legislation, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that are focused on these things. The For the People Act actually really has a specific section about redistricting, but that's a presentation for a different day. So back to our districts and how they're determined, specifically in Nebraska. Remember, we're talking about our legislature, and Nebraska is kind of unique in that we have what's called a unicameral. So unlike other states or the national government, instead of having 2 legislative houses, the House and the Senate, we just have 1. And part of the reasoning behind that is because when it was created, the idea was the people would be the second house. So we are built in. They expect us. We are expected to be involved with this process. Now, how does this happening from a district standpoint, and where do we fit in? Well, it all starts with getting support from our Legislative Research Office. And these are folks who are data scientists. They know how to draw maps. So they draft initial maps that then go to our legislature to kind of tweak. All of this is part of the process guidelines, and these are written out in our rules of the legislature. Specifically, they tell you what the makeup of this committee needs to look like. 9 members, 3 per district, because remember, we have 3 congressional districts. No more than 5 individuals from 1 party. They have to engage the public, and it even lays out very specifically what that looks like. This is our 2021 redistricting committee. Senator Lou Ann Linehan there is the chair. So these are the folks that you definitely want to be thinking about if you're going to be communicating with individuals, in addition to your own legislator. Now let's talk a little bit about the chronology of the process. So first, the initial data is made available. So this, actually the very initial data just came out in April. From that, they get more data throughout the summer. The Legislative Research Office starts drafting those maps. They give kind of a general map of what makes sense. And then that goes to this redistricting committee and they can adjust those maps. Now, this is here where both good and maybe not so good things happen because they know the state. And so they can look at the state and say, we're splitting up a community here. But it is also a place where gerrymandering can happen. So this is where us little blue people come in. This is the first place that the public really can jump in and provide feedback on those. After that, there's the formal public hearings on proposed maps. There's required to be one in each congressional district. This is another great place, very clearly, where the little people come in to share what we think of those maps. Once that happens, the maps are sent to the legislature for approval because our maps are actually written into law. And so it follows the process like any other law would. The legislature has to vote on it. Again, a place where we can jump in, talk to our own senators, share our feedback. And then finally, if passed, that goes to the governor to either sign or veto. So that's the process. Let's put that in terms of some dates, some actual timeline. This year's a little different than it has been in the past, mostly because of the census delay. So the apportionment counts, again, how many pepperoni should be on the pizza, arrived in April. So we've got kind of a ballpark idea. The actual census metric data, so we can see where those population changes have been, won't be here until midsummer. And then that data really isn't in its full form until September. So we're talking about that first draft of maps not being available until September, October. What that means for us, our legislative session will be over. So our legislature, our unicameral, will call what's called a special session to bring back that group of people to make those maps. So that's that special legislative session. And some things that are impacted by this or to think about is that number one, the timeline may move more quickly than it has in the past. Public hearings may have really short notice, so it's even more important to be plugged in. There might not be as time to integrate all that public feedback into the maps. And then finally, this one's kind of an interesting one. This is really pushing the time that gets approved into law and then signed or vetoed by the legislator, by the governor, really close to our next filing dates for candidates. Now, why does this matter? Because some people might not even know what district they can run in because they don't know what the map is. So it really behooves people to move through this process quickly. But then again, that's why we need to really keep an eye on it to make sure that our feedback's getting heard, even if it is going a little quick. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about now the redistricting process, the line drawing process with our pizza math. So let's take our pizza from before. Now we're going to make half of the pieces Canadian bacon or ham. So really, we've got 10 pieces of Canadian bacon, 10 pieces of ham. This is a half and half pizza. Depends on how you draw the lines. Because as you can see here in our example from before, if you use these lines, we've actually made 3 pieces that are predominantly pepperoni. So those are pepperoni slices. So that's 3 out of our 4 slices are pepperoni. It's a pepperoni pizza, just based on what's majority, right? Well, let's draw our lines a little differently. Now we have a pizza that has 3 pieces that are predominantly ham and only 1 with pepperoni. So this is a ham pizza. Again, equal numbers, just drawing the lines differently. Finally, if we draw the lines this way, we have 2 pieces that are predominantly ham, 2 pieces that are predominantly pepperoni. This is a half and half pizza. So this is what we're aiming for, but this is why where the lines are drawn makes a difference. So this is the idea of redistricting. And when we talk about redistricting and we talk about gerrymandering, which you heard a little bit about earlier, what does that actually look like in real life, not just on pizza? Well, it's this process of drawing for political benefit, and it's done in 2 main ways. The first is called packing, and the second is called cracking. Packing basically means putting everybody together in one section, and cracking means the exact opposite. Everyone who's already kind of in a section, splitting them so they don't have a full majority anywhere you put them. And I'm going to let this video kind of explain because it's a really great visual.
Basics of gerrymandering are actually pretty simple. If you're a Republican trying to keep power, you want to do 2 things. First, pack as many Democratic voters as possible into a single district. If you have a district where almost everyone votes Democrat, that means almost half these votes are basically wasted. You can also crack big Democratic areas into separate districts where there are slightly more Republicans. So even though an area has a lot of Democratic votes, they would actually lose in this district and in this district. These are the two elements of classic gerrymandering.
So again, it's the way those lines are drawn that can really make a difference. What we're really wanting to focus on here is the idea that districts should be contiguous, so they're connected, compact, and equally populated. That's what we're aiming for in these districts. So why are we even talking about this? Why should we be worried, especially in Nebraska? Is this a big deal? It actually is something we want to be aware of. This is some research that's been done about states that are at risk for gerrymandering, and we actually fall in the high category. That's for a couple different reasons. The first of which is the fact that this happens in our legislature. So there's an innate threat that it's going to be partisan because it's in the political body. The second reason is that all three of our branches of government are currently controlled by the same party. So again, it just makes it harder to overcome some of that partisanship. And then finally, our state, just how it's set up geographically and demographically, makes it just ripe for gerrymandering. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me explain a little bit. And we're going to use the example of political affiliation, just because it's kind of easy to wrap our heads around. We could replace this with anything: race, ethnicity, class, religion, but we're talking just in terms of party because it's easier to think of it that way. So when we think about Nebraska, what is Nebraska? You'll see that 48% of registered voters by the latest data are Republicans, 29 are Democrats, 22 are nonpartisan or independents, and 1% are libertarians. This is kind of interesting because a lot of times we think of Nebraska as being a very red state, but technically less than 50% of the population is registered Republicans. So how does this affect how we're represented? And again, keep in mind, the purpose of fair maps is that there's a competitive opportunity, that these voices might be able to be heard in any given competition. It's not guaranteeing anything. So when we take a look at what our state looks like, and then we look at our state legislature representation-wise, you'll see that 35% is Democrat. These are the folks in Lincoln who are making our state laws, and 65% are Republican. So both Democrats and Republicans are technically overrepresented when you look just at that voters, but there's still a split. There's still kind of that representation. Now, if you look at our national representation, it's completely Republican. So those are our three Congress people, are all Republican. Now, again, I want to be very clear. Redistricting is not about drawing lines to guarantee a representative government. It's to make it a competitive place. In fact, that's what we're trying to avoid, is any sort of district drawing that would make a guarantee of any kind. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look. Let's put this on a map. So when we talk about our three congressional districts, and this data is from 538, which does some statistical analysis. Basically what they've done here is they've shown us our three districts, and then down at the bottom, it indicates how competitive those could be. So as you can see, there's enough of that representation of other areas that the Omaha area, which is District 2, falls in that purple category. It could kind of go either way, depending on the candidates. That is fairly representative of the data we just looked at, right? So they also ran some things about what different gerrymandering could look like. So this map is gerrymandering to favor Democrats. And you'll see that it kind of takes that Nebraska 2nd and makes it the I-80 corridor from Lincoln to Omaha, but it's still purple. It's still representative of that competitive piece. Now, if you were to gerrymander to favor Republicans, you would do what we saw in a video a minute ago, that idea of cracking. So that's basically cutting a line right through Omaha so that you disperse those voters from different political affiliations in a way that they don't have enough of a majority in either district. And you can see statistically, it makes it impossible to have a potentially competitive district. And this is the concept of gerrymandering. So why do we focus in on that Nebraska 2nd, that kind of Omaha metro area? Well, one, because it's highly populated. There are 1.12 million people just in these 5 counties. That's 58% of Nebraska's total population. So there's a lot of opportunity for cracking and packing to happen. And as another point to look at, you can see here that this was before 2010 is what our congressional district looked like. And there was a lot of debate when this happened, that you'll see that Bellevue was included down in that area. When the lines were redrawn, as you can see here after 2010, Bellevue was removed and some of the more Republican leaning areas to the west of Omaha were added into that district too, which changed the balance a little bit. So this is that idea, is these lines are being drawn ideally with no politics involved, but the people drawing them are the politicians. So that's why we as the second house need to make sure that we're paying attention. So after 2022, it's up to us. We get to help shape that. So how do we do that? What's next? Number one, talk to your friends and family. Redistricting only happens every 10 years. Most people don't know about it. Heck, we didn't really even know much about it until we started doing research about 3 months ago. So talk to your friends and family. Number two, use social media. Here are some great resources to get information up to date. Like we talked about, the timeline is going to be pretty quick. So you want to be in the know about when things are happening. And these here are a few organizations that are focused on nonpartisan, fair maps, again, which is our goal. If you are going to join the conversation online, make sure you're using these hashtags so that we can amplify our voice. And then what else can you do? You can actually take action. Contact your policymakers. I can't tell you the number of times that I listened to the live stream of our legislature and they say, well, I got an email from a constituent. They actually read that stuff. So tell them what you think. Send them a letter, call them, send them an email. There's a portal online where you can provide input. Use those opportunities. Attend future events. From the League of Women Voters standpoint, we're having a really cool event this summer where we're going to raise awareness through a 5K run and a bike ride to kind of draw attention to this idea that we want fair maps to be representative. And of course, those public hearings we talked about. Finally, join the league and keep learning. It's free to students to join, so hop on there and you can join and you'll get regular updates in your inbox. You can also follow us on all those social media sites. And then finally, we have a great resource page that is just about redistricting. We update it all the time with new articles, new data. So if you just want to bookmark that and check out every once in a while and say, hey, what's going on with redistricting, then that's a great place to go. So with that, that's our kind of crash course in redistricting. I want you to take a minute and think about what your one takeaway is. And maybe that's what struck you most from this conversation. Maybe what surprised you. What questions do you still have? Or maybe it's give yourself an action item. Write down what you're going to do. I'm going to talk to 5 people about redistricting, or I'm going to make sure that I follow the Princeton gerrymandering project. Whatever it is, give yourself something to do so that this sticks, because it's really important. Because remember back to the words you described to your community, we want to make sure that your community stays your community and you still have a voice in your community. We talk about Nebraska being the good life, and it is the good life, but we got to put a little in to make sure that it stays the good life. Thank you so much for your time. Please reach out to us if you have any questions, we've enjoyed talking to you. Thanks. Have a good one.